Thank you, Presiding Officer. New statistics released this week revealed that January of this year was the worst month ever for long waits at Scotland's A&E departments. Almost 9,000 patients waited over half a day for emergency treatment. We spoke to Kirstine Campbell from Rossshire. She spent over 7 hours in a waiting room at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital after experiencing symptoms of a heart attack or blood clot during a visit to Clydebank. To alleviate the pain she was in, Kirstine had to lie on the floor. She told me surrounded by vomit and other bodily fluids because there was no bed available. So what does Humza Yousaf have to say to Kirstine, and how is he going to fix this problem?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, before I answer Douglas Ross's question, I did want to just say, and on behalf of the Scottish Government and indeed the party that I lead, that how sad we were about the tragic news of the loss of Nick Sheridan. Nick was an extremely talented journalist and author. He'll be greatly missed. Many of us in this chamber will have been questioned by Nick quite robustly, no doubt, whether it was on BBC Drive Time or in many of the other programmes that he presented. My thoughts are with his family, his many friends and indeed his colleagues. It will undoubtedly be a very sad time indeed, Presiding Officer. In terms of the question that Douglas Ross asks, a very serious question, of course, indeed, what I would say to Kirstine Campbell and anybody else that's had to wait too long is, first and foremost, this government apologises to anybody who has to wait longer than any of us would expect in relation to A&E treatment or indeed when it comes to elective care or diagnostics. But it is precisely because we're still recovering from that global pandemic, which has affected every single health service in the country, that the Deputy First Minister stood here and ensured that we have record funding, over £19.5 billion of funding going into the NHS. It's also why, of course, we ensured that those who are at the front line, who are dealing with the likes of Kirstine, treating Kirstine, caring for Kirstine, and many other patients across Scotland, we ensure that they're the best paid in the entire UK. It's why we ensured that we increased their pay to record levels. It's why, of course, we've also increased staffing levels by historic highs under this government. So are the long waits that too many patients have to endure acceptable? Not at all. And that is why we're investing in our NHS. That's why we're investing in our staff. What makes that far more difficult, of course, is when we have those real-term budget cuts that come from Westminster, that slash public spending, not just in NHS England, but then have a consequence here in Scotland. So this government will continue to invest in our NHS, but most crucially, continue to invest in our NHS staff, who do an incredible job day in and day out.
Douglas Ross.
On behalf of the Scottish Conservatives, can I also pay tribute to Nick Sheridan? I have been interviewed by him in the past, and he was a robust but extremely professional journalist, and I know his loss will be felt so much by his family and his friends, and in particular his colleagues at the BBC and across the media, with whom he was so highly regarded. But I listened carefully to the First Minister's answer there, and the example I gave about Kirstine and A&E departments in question 1 is replicated across our NHS. This week, we also learned that patients are nearly 30 times more likely to be waiting over 2 years for treatment in Scotland's NHS than they would be south of the border. There are more than 8,000 patients waiting over 2 years for treatment in Scotland's NHS. 8,000 waiting over 2 years. Does Humza Yousaf think it's acceptable for one person, never mind thousands, to wait more than 2 years for treatment? And what is he planning to do specifically to deal with these appalling waits for treatment?
First Minister.
In my first response, that we don't believe that anybody who has to endure a long wait, be it for unscheduled care, be it for elective care, be it for diagnostics, is acceptable. But we also, of course, all understand, I hope, that the impact of the global pandemic has affected health services, not just in Scotland, but right across the world. Douglas Ross asks, what are we doing about it? It's because of our investment in the NHS, because of that record investment in the NHS, that we are seeing progress, we are seeing recovery. If I looked at the statistics that were out this week that Douglas Ross references, for example, we saw that in operations performed, there was an increase in January of 15% compared to the month before. And in fact, if we compare to January from the year before, there was a 16% increase. That shows, of course, activity moving in the right directions. In January, we saw January of this year, 702 operations carried out each day. That compares to 604 in the January prior. We look at long waits. There have been some, again, elements of recovery. We look at those who are waiting over 2 years in terms of new outpatients. That's down 66%. If I look at 2-year inpatients and day cases, down 25%. And Douglas Ross asks again, what specifically are you doing about it? Well, we're making sure that we're investing in our capacity. That's why, through our network of treatment centres, for example, 20,000 additional surgeries, we've provided that capacity. But I go back to my central point and end on this point, Presiding Officer. We're investing record amounts in our NHS. We're investing in our staff. We're making sure they're the best paid. That job becomes immeasurably difficult when we have a UK government that is taking £500 million out of our budget in real terms over the last 2 years. And for that, Douglas Ross really needs to use whatever influence, and we know, of course, he doesn't have much influence, but whatever influence he has to make sure that the Conservatives fund public services, not slash them to the bone.
Douglas Ross.
I think it's really important when we're speaking about our NHS and patients, we speak to those 8,000 people across Scotland who are suffering, waiting over 2 years.
We'll just suspend this meeting briefly. Thank you, colleagues. We will resume our business, and I go to Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was saying to the 8,000 people in Scotland waiting more than 2 years for treatment, they want to hear more from Scotland's First Minister about how he is going to deal with this. And unsurprisingly, Humza Yousaf is still blaming COVID, but the crisis in Scotland's NHS has continued to get worse since the pandemic. Since Humza Yousaf became First Minister, more than 500,000 days have been lost due to delayed discharge. That means over the last 12 months, 500,000 hospital beds that could have been available for other patients. Now, the SNP promised. They promised to eradicate delayed discharge 8 years ago. If they'd done that, as they promised, well, I think the First Minister just said that's stupid. It was a promise. It was a promise. It was a promise from the SNP government.
Colleagues, let's conduct our business in an orderly fashion.
We were disagreeing with something, so I'll be interested to know, is the First Minister disagreeing that it was a promise to eradicate completely delayed discharge 8 years ago? Because if they had done that, waiting times would have been lower for emergency care, for ambulances and for emergency treatment. So can I ask Humza Yousaf, how costly has that failure to eradicate delayed discharge been to patients waiting in Scotland's NHS?
First Minister.
First of all, Presiding Officer, Douglas Ross really should withdraw and retract his comment. I didn't say anything, in fact. Well, Douglas Ross, I didn't say anything actually.
Colleagues, First Minister, if I might just ask you to take a seat. It's exceptionally important that we conduct our business in an orderly fashion. The way that we can best do that, is not to shout and point at one another. It's to ensure that when the person who's been called to speak, they have an opportunity to do that, and that we listen respectfully. First Minister.
Yes, and that's right, Presiding Officer. I mean, Douglas Ross, clearly, having been left hung out to dry by his own colleagues, is desperate to simply just make up what is being said or not being said. And what I would say, Presiding Officer, in terms of when it comes to the NHS here in Scotland, I'm very proud of the fact that the actions that we have taken means that Scotland remains the only country in the UK where we've not lost a single day to NHS strike action anywhere in the UK. And when it comes to social care, which Douglas Ross is absolutely right to point to, Brexit, of course, has been a complete and utter disaster for social care recruitment. And not only that, the recent changes to migration and the migration rules have been described as absolutely devastating by those who work in social care, presiding officer. Add to that what I've already said, a real terms cut to our budget over the last couple of years, and indeed a £1.3 billion cut to our capital, which directly affects health infrastructure, then we are attempting to recover our NHS in the face of over 14 years of Conservative austerity, presiding officer. So the Scottish Government, the SNP-led Scottish Government, will invest in our NHS, make sure we have record staffing levels, the best paid NHS staff anywhere in the UK, and will continue to make sure that we invest in our public services while Douglas Ross and his party take a hatchet to public services right across the UK.
Douglas Ross.
Last week, one whistleblower in NHS Grampian revealed to the Press and Journal paper that at one stage 18 ambulances were stuck outside Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. The whistleblower said this could have been up to half of the North East fleet of ambulances stuck in one place, unable to leave, instead of supporting and protecting the communities we serve. I can repeat this if the First Minister is getting advice from the Health Secretary, because I think it's really important.
Please continue, Mr. Ross.
I think it's really important that the First Minister listens to what our professionals are saying in Scotland's NHS. Because this whistleblower in NHS Grampian continued. What? Is that the response we're going to get from a Cabinet Secretary in this Scottish Government? And I hope that is withdrawn. I hope that is withdrawn.
Mr. Ross.
I hope that is withdrawn.
Mr. Ross, can I just say that I did not hear the comment that you have obviously heard, Mr. Ross, from the floor, but it is absolutely essential that members desist from any commentary when their colleagues are putting questions to one another and responding to them. We are not going to continue in this vein. I would be grateful if members would remind themselves of standing orders and the need to treat one another with courtesy and respect. Mr. Ross.
I can't believe Angus Robertson is smirking after saying that when I am quoting from an ambulance worker in NHS Grampian. So I will continue to read out their words because they seem to be uncomfortable for this SNP government. This whistleblower in NHS Grampian continued. Many of my colleagues share a concern that we are unable to help those most in need because we're tied up at hospital and not where they need us to be. And this is happening across Scotland. We spoke to Ian Black, who gave up waiting for an ambulance after 15 hours when he was told that Monklands Hospital was full. When he eventually got an ambulance the following morning, it emerged he'd suffered a stroke. Ian's still alive to explain his situation, but if this happened to other people, they might not be. Waiting 15 hours for an ambulance after a stroke will be fatal in other circumstances. So will the First Minister please take this more seriously than others on his front bench and tell us what urgent action he is taking to stop ambulances being stuck outside Scotland's hospitals, because people will lose their lives if he does not.
First Minister.
Of course we take this issue seriously. I'm not sure why Douglas Ross is so rattled this session of First Minister's questions. He mentioned the Press and Journal. It may be something to do, of course, with a great paper which I read many on with regularity, presiding officer.
Members.
In terms of the health challenges that those across the country are facing, and no doubt that the Scottish Ambulance Service also facing those challenges. That is why we've increased the funding for the Scottish Ambulance Service in the next financial year. And of course, in this financial year, we assured that the Scottish Ambulance Service was provided £50 million. That funding, of course, helped them recruit an additional 317 staff by April of this year. So we're increasing the staff, recruiting more staff where we possibly can. There is no getting away from the fact, Presiding Officer, that the global pandemic impacted on health services right across the country, and including, of course, here in Scotland. Despite that, and thanks to the effort of incredible paramedics, incredible Agenda for Change staff, incredible doctors up and down this country, that's why we have and continue to have the best performing A&E in comparison to other parts of the UK. It's why we have the best paid staff in comparison to the UK. It's why we have more qualified nurses and midwives per head than in England. That's why we've not lost a single day of NHS activity to strike action. It's why when we look at waiting times, for example, we have made improvements and recovery, but there is still far more for us to do. So this government is not just committed to the NHS, we'll support it in its greatest hour of need by ensuring it has that record investment, that record over £19.5 billion investment, in very stark contrast to the UK Conservative government that has slashed public spending to the absolute bone so that Douglas Ross and high earners can get a tax cut. That is the wrong priorities, Presiding.